In this lesson, we'll be talking about one of the most integral tasks you'll see in critical reasoning questions on the executive assessment, and that's going to be those asking you to identify an assumption. So, as always, we'll start just by recapping the question logistics for critical reasonings on the test. We need to assume that there's going to be 3 to 5 critical reasonings in the 14-question verbal section. You're going to have 1 to 3 critical reasonings in each 7-question half. You're going to have a single paragraph pertaining to a unique question task for each of these question formats. Your strategic best practices, you're going to want to assume about 2.5 minutes per question on average, because you've got to note the details more closely. You're going to have a maximum of 3 minutes for any of these question types. You're going to want to note the task of the question before engaging the prompt. And you'll consider skipping critical reasonings on the first pass through a half to ensure that you see all of the questions. These are going to be more time consuming, so if you want to go deal with all of the reading comprehension and sentence corrections first, you can potentially do that. You can, of course, take targeted notes and should take targeted notes to force engagement and proactively address the specific question task for the problem, in this case, to identify an assumption. And remember that these are the primary question format to guess and skip in your second half if you have fewer than 15 minutes remaining after question 7 means that indicates that you have completed the first half of the verbal section. So let's talk about how you recognize these tasks. First, you're going to have a reference to an argument or recommendation in the question stem. Then you're going to see some task words, such as assumption, assumes, or depends. And you have to be careful about not confusing an assumption task as equal to a strengthened task. So strengthened tasks ask you for new information. Assumption tasks are asking you to find something that must be true already in the argument. So don't just look for something that's good for the argument. Look for something that's necessary for the argument to get the right answer for these assumption tasks. So strategically, you'll have to note the very specific details of the argument whenever you're looking at an assumption task. You can also be prepared to note that extremes can be necessary assumptions. So don't eliminate answer choices just because they say all or they say none. And we'll talk about this more later on in this lesson. But the extremes can be necessary assumptions because something that is necessary by its nature is kind of extreme. You'll want to, of course, attempt to categorically identify the type of argument to broadly predict possible assumptions. And you can use what is known as the negation test to consider 2 or 3 remaining answer choices after you've eliminated for common wrong answers. But recognize that a task reversal for a common wrong answer when it comes to assumption tasks may just be something that goes too far about what is necessary. You don't actually need that to be necessary. It's something that you're like, well, that's not required by the argument. And of course, you can eliminate answer choices more quickly once you find one that matches your close to specific prediction of what you'd expect the right assumption to be. So, of course, the assumption is key to our argumentation equation. And we know the argumentation equation always leads up to a conclusion. That's your explicitly stated subjective opinion requiring some sort of support. That support, of course, comes from the premise. And those are going to be your objective, explicit facts that are intended to provide support for that conclusion. And the assumption is what ties it all together. It's the implicit, unstated facts that must be true to provide the link. And an assumption task asks you to literally find out or find an answer choice that matches what those unstated facts are, or at least gives one of them. So how do you identify assumptions in an argument? Well, you want to predict as specifically as possible based on the type of argument what must be true to reasonably believe the conclusion based on the given premise. And properly categorizing your argument can help you to focus on the details that you may have otherwise overlooked as leaps of logic. So you want to make sure that you're noting term shifts. You want to make sure that the evidence does represent, does in some way have an interpretation that would relate to the conclusion, or that the sample is representative of the whole. So of course, we're just going to start by recapping our common arguments and their assumptions. So an analogy means that the 2 items are comparable. So our assumption is that the items in the argument are comparable in relevant ways. Representation arguments are going to have the assumption that the evidentiary sample is representative of the larger whole, whatever that is. Your data and evidence interpretation assumption is that there are no other reasonable interpretations of that data or evidence than the one that was offered by the argument. A causality assumes that there are no other possible causes or outcomes based on the relationship, and that whatever the circumstance is that's being described is not merely a coincidence. And plans or recommendations assume A, that the plan or recommendation is going to be executed, and that the approach will work according to the defined metric of success, and to a degree is necessary. So let's take a look at an example critical reasoning prompt and question stem. So, as always, we start with question stem. We've got which of the following is an assumption that the argument requires. So, we see the key term indicating and identifying assumption task of assumption. So, that tells us we've got an assumption task. It's pretty straightforward. So, let's begin reading the paragraph. Agriculturally, few resources are as valuable as fertile topsoil. However, one of the most prolific North American crops, corn, depletes this resource at a rate of 2 bushels of topsoil eroded for every bushel of corn harvested. Therefore, corn production in North America should be phased out in favor of crops that are less detrimental to topsoil. And we see the word should, and that is going to indicate a plan or recommendation based argument. So we, of course, have the conclusion already, which is the plan that's being offered. And our stock assumption for all plans is that it's going to work. So we need to find something more specifically that must be true to believe that the plan to phase out corn production is necessary and will work to basically save the topsoil, as articulated by the argument. So we introduce the answer choices. And as always, we'll work through the process of elimination using our common wrong reasons, starting with vague impacts. And we've got a really vague one in choice B. Topsoil composition can vary greatly from one region to another. Well, the can, I don't know whether it does or doesn't. That's an incredibly vague verb. One region to another. We're talking about North American. Is North America a region? Are we talking about regions within North America? There are so many questions that are introduced by choice B. We can eliminate it pretty quickly for being vague and needing additional information. And there are some other ones that other answer choices that probably need some additional information too, such as corn is an integral part of most American diets. Okay. Can it be replaced? Do the people eating corn like it? There's a lot more questions than the answers here as well, so we could probably eliminate that pretty confidently. And we've got task reversals as well. They're a little bit different for assumption tasks. So things that should not be true because they weaken the argument. So very few crops are as prolific as corn. Well, if that's true, well, we don't really want to. This gives a reason we don't want to phase out corn because it's a prolific crop and we kind of want to keep it, right? So it's also a little bit redundant because one of the most prolific crops is kind of the same as very few crops are as prolific as corn. But regardless, it's more so giving a reason that we wouldn't want to execute the plan as opposed to being something that we need to believe the plan is valid. And then we've got things that don't need to be true. So things that go a little bit too far that aren't required by the argument, such as choice E. Erosion is the single biggest threat to topsoil in America, in North America. Maybe, but it's not necessary. Erosion could not be the single biggest threat, and that's fine, and just being a significant threat. So that too can be eliminated as something that's kind of a task reversal because it's not necessary. But choice C, we've got fertile topsoil is an exhaustible resource. Well, this is the entire crux of the argument. We need that to be true because that explains why we need to save the topsoil. Because if the topsoil was not an exhaustible resource, well, why do we need to save it? It's there and it's always going to be there. It replenishes itself in some fashion. So we select choice C because it's something that's necessary for the argument or the recommendation to even be like reasonable. Like if the topsoil were not an exhaustible resource, why do we need to phase out corn? Corn's fine. So you can see that we're already implicitly using what is known as the negation test. So step one for the negation test for assumptions is going to be to work the problem as normal, reaching 2 or 3 options by eliminating choices against your proactively predicted assumption. You don't want to negate everything. It's just too time consuming. So instead, work through the problem as normal, predict your assumption broadly based off the type of argument that you see, and then eliminate. And potentially, like we saw with the example just previous to now, you won't even need to apply the negation test explicitly. But if you're down to 2 or 3, you want to take a remaining answer choice and negate its impact by adding or removing the word not from the main verb or action of the sentence, and or applying a technically oppositional quantity. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail here in a moment. Step 3 is then going to be to apply the negated information from the choice to determine the impact of that negation on the viability of the conclusion. So you have to see what happens when the choice's information is now assumed to be false, basically. If nothing changes in the argument when you negate the choice, so when the statement is false, then you eliminate that answer choice as not necessary for the conclusion, because when you took it away, the argument still was fine. And the entire point of the negation is that when you take away a necessary assumption, the whole argument should fall apart. And that's how you know your right answer. If the argument fails upon negating your choice, then you need to select that choice as your negated fail, indicating that the affirmative of the choice was necessary for the conclusion to be believed in the first place. Now, for negation, we have to consider technical quantities, because if I asked 10 people on the street, what's the opposite of all? I bet you most of them will say none. And that is not technically correct, because there's a whole spectrum of options in between all and none. And that's basically why we consider it as percentages. It's the same way as saying the opposite of rich is not poor. It's not rich, because if I say somebody is, the opposite of rich, it just means they're not rich. It doesn't mean they go all the way to poor. So technically, the opposing quantity of all is not all, because that captures all other possibilities except for all. When we're considering most in English, most means greater than 50% or more than half. So our technically opposing quantity is going to be not most, or less than or equal to 50%. And some means more than 0%. And our opposing quantity here is going to be none. And the reason that this matters is because we can consider just a circumstance where all of these may be true, some of these may be true, but we wouldn't think of it that way in like our normal logic. So let's just take the statement, most dogs have 4 legs. Well, so too do some dogs have 4 legs, even though you're going to say probably most dogs. It's not incorrect to say that not some dogs have 4 legs, because clearly some do. Similarly, we could even do it with something more extreme, such as the statement, all dogs breathe oxygen, because that's true. All dogs do breathe oxygen, but so too do most dogs, because that is greater than 50%, and it goes all the way up to all. Similarly, some dogs also breathe oxygen, even though this is not a statement that anybody would actually make, because it's much more accurate logically to say all dogs breathe oxygen, because you're capturing the closest to the truth. But some dogs too breathe oxygen, because the only thing that is absolutely false about dogs breathing oxygen would be the statement that no dogs breathe oxygen, because clearly some do, most do, and all do. So this is how you want to consider your technical quantities when it comes up in the negation test on assumption tests in particular. So let's take a look at one more example where we might apply that negation test. So as always, we start with the question stem. We've got which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends. We see the word assumption, we see the word depends. So this is clearly an assumption task. We read from the beginning of the paragraph. For a decade, annual surveys have provided regular information about the Donderonia hospital system, and those surveys have consistently shown that urban hospitals experience a much higher inpatient mortality rate than rural ones do. This clearly shows that Donderonia's rural hospitals are run better than their urban counterparts. So we've got the evidence coming from surveys, so this should clue you in that we've got a representative sampling style argument. So we've got our conclusion, which is that Donderonia's rural hospitals are run better than their urban counterparts, and it is specifically from the surveys about higher inpatient mortality rates. So we can broadly predict our categorical assumption as there's no other info to reinterpret the data, and there's no other possible cause for the higher mortality rate at urban hospitals than that they are run more poorly than our rural hospitals. So we're looking for some new evidence or new information that makes us go, actually, it may not be that they're just poorly run. Now, looking at our answer choices, we've got to consider our common wrong reasons, starting with vague impacts, and we've got a really nice vague one in choice E. Outpatient procedures are more common in Donderonia than are inpatient procedures. Okay, more common. Like 1 more, 2 more, 2 million more. And this doesn't even distinguish between our rural versus the urban, which is clearly the issue of the argument. So we can eliminate that. And we could also say that it needs additional information as would introducing the concept of neighboring nations in choice B. Donderonia hospitals are considered inferior to those of neighboring nations. Okay, well, how does that affect, again, the rural versus urban divide that we clearly have at issue in this argument? So we can eliminate choice B. And then choice D, the diets of rural citizens vary greatly. I mean, you've got to take a few logical leaps to think that this is the assumption because we don't know what very greatly means. We don't know if that means that they're healthier, less healthy. There's a whole bunch of different issues there. And in this case, there's not necessarily a task reversal that's happening in this in the two remaining answer choices. So we may need to apply the negation test. So we'll start with choice A. We've got urban hospitals usually admit thousands more patients per month than do rural hospitals. So we're clearly comparing the urban to rural, which is relevant in the argument. So we'll apply the negation test by just inserting the words do not. So urban hospitals usually do not admit thousands more patients per month than do rural hospitals. And you go, okay, well, they don't. I can still believe that the rural hospitals are run more better. I mean, again, if they don't admit more patients, if anything, it makes them seem more similar in function and form. So at best, this is going to be a negated strength, and it makes the argument seem better. And we wanted the argument to fail upon negation, so we'd eliminate choice A. Now, for choice C, we've got urban environments in Donderonia are not suffering from a fatal drug overdose epidemic. Well, we can just cross out the not in our minds. So, if urban environments in Donderonia are suffering from a fatal drug overdose epidemic, well, now we have a different reason that we'd have as an explanation for why the urban hospitals are experiencing a much higher inpatient mortality rate. Because now we've got drug overdoses that may not be occurring in the rural hospitals that are occurring in the urban ones. So it shows that it's not necessarily that the rural hospitals are run better; they just don't have this fatal drug overdose epidemic. So upon negation, we see that the argument kind of fails. And so that's going to be our correct answer as an assumption that's necessary. Because in the affirmative, we do need to assume that the urban environments in Donderonia are not suffering from this drug overdose epidemic, because that would have been another possible way to interpret evidence from the surveys or just a different possible cause. So let's talk about just addressing these tasks holistically. As always, note the task by recognizing key indicator terms such as depends and assumption, and the presence of an argument with a main conclusion. Then you'll read the prompt as written, paying close attention to the type of information provided in the premise, and note your explicit conclusion. If you can identify a common argument, you'll want to more specifically predict what a categorical assumption in the argument may be based on the premise. But if no common argument is identified, you could just use the generic prediction of find what must be true to believe the conclusion that whatever the conclusion is. And step 4 is going to be to eliminate choices against the prediction using your common wrong answer choices or answer reasons. But you can apply the negation test for assumption tasks only if you find yourself down to 2 or 3. So let's hop on over to the whiteboard and take a look at an example to see how you'll engage with your scratch work when you encounter assumption tasks on the executive assessment. So here we have a sample critical reasoning style question for the exam. And we've got A, B, C, D, E, and we put a little line over top for our potential task. And we start with which of the following is an assumption upon which the conductor's argument depends. So we can clearly see we need to find an assumption. So this is an assumption task. And we just write out assumption. So then we're just going to put PA up here for predicted assumption, and we'll start by reading the paragraph. So we, of course, have a claimed conductor. The cost of assembling a professional orchestra keeps all but the largest cities from having a symphony in residence. However, the value of a symphony to its community is priceless for the inspiration it provides to listeners of all ages. A smaller city could reap these benefits only by soliciting the largesse of wealthy philanthropists, but the efforts would surely be rewarded. So we've got a theoretical plan from this acclaimed conductor. And so our predicted assumption is just going to be what must be to believe that the plan to solicit, and we'll just call them WPs for wealthy philanthropists, will work and is necessary for small cities to benefit from a community symphony. So we just got to find something that must be true to believe that, yeah, we need to have a wealthy philanthropist. That's the only way for these small cities to benefit from a community symphony. So all inspirational symphonies are comprised of professional musicians. So we're at least talking about the relevant pieces here. And at worst, I'd probably hold this with our little tilde because we're like, okay, we see the word inspiration up here. We've got professionals. We've got symphony all over the place. So we're at least using the right terms. There's no term shift. Now, some quality symphonies are comprised entirely of amateurs. Well, this too, we've got quality symphonies. And again, this is getting a little bit different because I don't see what quality means, but we see that it's at least talking about symphonies, and professionals and amateurs are kind of oppositional. So we'll hold that too for a moment. Now, many large cities without symphonies desire to have one. Well, we're talking about small cities, and this has really nothing to do with our assumption. At the very best, this is going to need additional info because we don't know how that is going to impact our conclusion about the small cities benefiting. Now, young listeners tend to care less for classical music than listeners of other demographics. Well, while this is the kind of thing our brain may assume, there's nothing in the argument about young listeners. It says listeners of all ages, but we don't care to call out specifically young listeners, at least according to the argument. So that too would require additional information, and we can eliminate choice D. And then a number of philanthropists wealthy enough to support a symphony reside in smaller cities. Well, a number. What number? Is it one? Does this person want to give to a symphony? I have more questions than answers from choice E, so that too can be eliminated for needing additional information. So then we can apply our negation test and we can think about our technical qualities because, or our technical quantities, that is. So if we're looking at choices A and B, let's start with choice A. We know that the opposite of all is not none, it's not all. So let's just put a little not over here. And we say not all inspirational symphonies are comprised of professional musicians. Well, the conductor's argument is actually predicated on the idea that the cost of a professional orchestra is what's keeping all but the largest cities, so anything that's not a large city, i.e., small cities, can't have a symphony in residence. But if choice A is true, then we could have non professional symphonies. And if we have non professional symphonies, they might be able to give the priceless inspiration, because not all inspirational symphonies are comprised of professional musicians, without the plan. So this is going to be what is called a negated fail. Whereas if we take a look at choice B, we know that the technically opposing quantity to some is in fact none. And we say no quality symphonies, as a negation, are comprised entirely of amateurs. Okay, so no quality symphonies are comprised entirely of amateurs. Well, we don't need to say that that's completely, not possible, because saying that they're not comprised entirely of amateurs, well, honestly, that makes it seem like this argument's getting better because now it seems like we can't go get amateur people. We need professional people, and it's professional people that need to be paid by the wealthy philanthropists in this conductor's argument. So this is going to be a negated strength, which is, again, the opposite of what the correct answer should do upon negation, because we don't want the removal of the assumption to make the argument stronger. We want the removal of the assumption to make the argument fail. So go ahead and practice some assumption tasks on your own, as your improvement on performance for these specific tasks should help with every other argument task as well.